leaving the class. Other people are stable.
Shortly, MTN is good. Yes, sir.
Okay, so now talking about, now I'm back to my personal network. So let's hope that that works for us for a while at least. Now, we said the sociological matter talks about law functionally as an instrument of social change. And we talked about some of the things. Even if you talk about sociological school, for example, sociological school has changed how students learn in terms of clinical legal education. So some of that could be things that have happened in other aspects of the society and then became inculcated in terms of how we learn as lawyers. Then the study of the development of law and social systems, that is the historical aspect. You cannot be lawyers and not understand the history of law, for example. You have to understand the history, how things happened, how society developed. And this can come from the perspective of something being, you have comparative studies, you have anthropological studies, as they say. Now, the last one is that some treat law as a consciousness and hence a philosophy of purpose. It means law is an ideology. And how does law become an ideology? We were talking about, I used one example the last time, and we spoke about body imaging technology, for example. And we talked about some of the things societies accept come from law being seen as a consciousness or an ideology. In Israel, for example, they could use body imaging, which basically strips you layer by layer of clothes, and they see whether you're carrying a bomb or whether you're not carrying a bomb or whatever. And that happens at the airport. Now, what this means is that the laws of privacy have been subjugated to the laws regarding security. And in a couple of states in the US, you also use body imaging technology at the airport. But most states in the US are focused on privacy rather than security, and they look at other ways to maintain security, which may not be as efficient as, for example, using a body imaging machine at the airport, because there are certain things that are attached to that. Number one, the loss of human dignity, the loss of privacy and all that. And then we said one of the things that we do that Africa may be called upon to take a look at will be in terms of how our law has a relationship with development. How do we develop our society? If we must develop our society, then the law must be at the vanguard of that objective. And then here, what we want to do, because like I told you, everything we are doing, most of it is as a foundation for understanding the schools of law and what are the questions that you ask yourself. Because by understanding what questions you want to ask for yourself, from yourself, when you look at the schools of law as we are having that discussion, it will be easier for you to be able to understand that, okay, this is what this relates to. This is what that relates to. So we have some thoughts on the idea of law. One of them is some of the earlier discussions that we have done. Number one, what is law? And I think it's a question every law student will ask himself. And when you come to understand what law is, you understand yourself as a unit within that construct of what the law is. I hope you are still with me.
Yes, sir.
Okay, then two, another thing that you look at when you are talking about the schools of jurisprudence will be, of course, what is the analysis of legal relationships, which we have also pointed out to now previously, and then we looked at it. Legal relationships, right? What is a right? When somebody says, I'm against the death penalty, why is he against the death penalty? What are the rights that he thinks have been derogated from by having a punishment of death over another person? When someone says, I have a right to human dignity, is the person talking about, you can't make rules relating to what I do with my body? As parents, can you force a parent to take his child to a school where he must be taught genetic studies that say that God did not create the world, that the world was a mistake? Because now that brings a difference in terms of whether you're a parent who owns your child or the state owns you and your child, and you're just an agent in charge of your children. So all these questions are great questions to ask, but they are answered better if you have an understanding of the schools of jurisprudence, and then you can choose which school, like a mirror, answers a particular question better for you. Then we also talked about what are the elements or components of law. We've talked about, obviously, when you are studying law, what is your focus? And all that dovetails into something that is important for you specifically, which is, what is the relationship between your understanding of law and your choice of law as a profession? And I asked this question because this question related to a lot of people. I had a lot of people who were reading law who knew, even as students, that they will never be lawyers. So what have you done? Have you taken a space that somebody else is entitled to and you wasted it? Those are questions that you will ask yourself, because I'm sure some of these questions you may never have sat down to seriously think about it. But by the time you do the schools of jurisprudence, you'll be asking those questions and you'll be armed and equipped to answer some of them. Now, again, another question could be, how must law, which we dealt with, is how must law be interpreted in a developing country? And we say, if you're a developing country, then you must have a kind of development theory in terms of how you interpret law. If, for example, somebody drives, you have an argument as to whether something is a vehicle or not. If you have the FRSC law saying if somebody drives a vehicle recklessly on the streets, then the FRSC, assuming, has the power to arrest and then to do so and prosecute and do whatever. Then the question should be, if you are interpreting this law in a developmental manner, how do you interpret it? What is a vehicle? Is a vehicle a car? Is a vehicle a motorcycle? Is a vehicle a bicycle? Or a wheelbarrow that your regular grocery seller puts inside, uses to cart his food and moves it down the street? What is your developmental interpretation? What does your law seek to achieve by that? And that has to be consistent, top down. Now, again, as we are studying jurisprudence, I think we need again to ask certain questions in terms of what jurisprudence should do. And people say, when we study this and we come together and we have this discussion over, is this jurisprudence, is this not jurisprudence? When we talk about what is law, what is not law and all that, like customary law, which was passed from father to child, jurisprudence must have certain things that it does, particularly for us as Africans. One of the things is that it must be jurisprudence must be seen in terms of an ideology. You know, we're talking about ideology, about whether something is a developmental, whether you have a development theory in terms of, it may not be a development theory, it may be another kind of theory. But there must always be an ideology. And what gives you an adequate ideology for a legal system is jurisprudence. Two, that jurisprudence must also, one of the things it must be seen as doing is that it must be seen as a heritage, as a legacy. It kind of passing down from I pass to you, you pass to somebody else. Maybe a day a child of mine will be studying law here. You pass jurisprudence to him, he passes it to someone else. And there can be that legacy of passage of knowledge. And thirdly, that it should be functional. Jurisprudence must apply to physical things. Our argument must be physical. When we talk about the noli prosequi, Otto Nzeribe and the federal government, we must have that discussion talking about something physical. And what was physical? What was happening in the National Assembly at the time? So every theory, every abstract must attach something physical for it to make sense and to have a meaning. And there are other areas of inquiry too, because there are questions that people ask, such as, is jurisprudence legal? When you say something is jurisprudence, is it the same thing as, these are questions I'm just throwing to you, and they are for you to engage with or not engage with. But you may not need to engage with them now. In another 20 years' time, you may need to engage. It could be in 10 years' time, when you become the Attorney General of your state, you may need to engage with some of these questions. Number one will be whether jurisprudence and legal theory are one and the same, or they are two different things. Another one could be, what is the importance of theories traveling well? I use that word, that phrase traveling well, because it was picked directly from somebody called William Twining. And William Twining was one of the students of HLA Hart. And he also started writing and had a more global stroke local view of what jurisprudence should be, because he's one of the few Western jurisprudence scholars who is interested in what other people call jurisprudence. And he said, when you say you have a theory, it should not be a theory just for the West. It should be a theory that travels well across jurisdictions. I hope we are still together.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes,
now,
sir.
when these theories travel well across jurisdictions, then it now means that you are having a theory. There are some theories that were not brought into, I was reading something on customary, a thesis on codification of customary law. And I was realizing that theories such as nemo judex, Latin maxims such as nemo judex in causa sua have been with us for centuries in the Yoruba language, Nupe language, and all kinds of languages. Right? Now, that is a theory that if somebody could say I was the first person that had that theory, that's the theory that has traveled well and is capable of traveling well. Why? Because it applies in the West, it applies in the North, it applies everywhere. So it's important that you have a world view of things, philosophies that you can use wherever it is that you go. And this could be, they may be philosophies that are not related to law. They could be personal philosophies. Then, if there's a universal, what does universal jurisprudence portend for the African continent? If there is a universal jurisprudence, what does it mean for us as Africans? Because a lot of times you find out that the reason Africans probably obey law, and I don't say this as, I just use this, I say this as a devil's advocate to incite inquiry. One of the things that Africans are said to be scared of is some kind of supernatural being or spirit or something that can bring punishment upon us. And that is why we obey things, especially things relating to customary law. These are some of the things that were tackled by Idowu when he was talking about the 7 myths of African jurisprudence. And he said, and they said, because we don't really have sanctions, the things that we are most scared of is, if you go to Okija, the Okija shrine, for example, to swear that you did not do something. What are you scared of? You are scared of the Okija spirit or whatever descending on you. And that was greater, in fact, than the sanctions that you have in legislation. And the question we ask ourselves is that why, to a very large extent, in comparison to other societies, we do not follow laws embedded in legislation? Because there's no spirit that will stab us in the night. Is that why many of us are lawless? So these are questions. I've seen people who say, don't mind it, don't let them do affirmation in courts. Tell them to hold the cutlass and put a gin on top of the cutlass and you swear on it. None of them will tell any lie in court. Is this true or not?
True, sir.
You say what?
I said that's true. People would respond well when such issues are used in court because people are afraid of the consequences of so-called gods.
There was one place against a man's wall. People were urinating there. Everybody, because it was just a convenient private place to just turn around, zip down your trousers and urinate. And people kept urinating on the man's wall. And then one day the man wrote, "Please urinate here. Please donate your urine here. Thank you." People stopped going there. Because the thing was, now what is he going to do with my urine? If he's trying to collect people's urine for something, I don't want to be the person he collects his urine for, whatever it is he wants to do. You understand? So all these are things. So when you now have something you call a universal jurisprudence, and you look at it in terms of, they are talking about sanctions and all that, Africa must look at its own jurisprudence and say, does this work for us? Does this not work for us? And that question must start now with you as students. Then the other one is that we must have relationships. We must understand the relationships of things. What is the relationship of international economics and politics, and what is the relationship of law? Recently, we were talking about a kind of vaccine law, and people were scared that that will mean that it will force us to be taking vaccines. There are rumors out there that there are chips inside the vaccines that will make us less productive. As in all honesty, if somebody were to stop me from being productive now, I'll even give him money for it. But that was a lot of fear that people have in terms of how the West are in control of medicine, and then what they can use that medicine and that technology for in respect of Africans. And as lawyers, as students, we must continue to understand the relationship between international economics, for example. A question is, why did a question you can ask is, this COVID pandemic, for example, and people understood, they understood clearly that the first person to have the COVID vaccine was almost like the first person to have the atomic bomb. Because in war politics, he has a lot of power. And because of that, laws will change. Because if you don't want COVID in your country, you have to protect your country from COVID, and how people also react to certain things. And it's changing as we speak. So all those are things that we need to, start looking at with better eyes as students, because lawyers must continue to be students throughout the course of their lives. Now, there are certain things, again, some of these inquiries are not things you read in respect of an exam, for example. There are things that you take a look at just out of being an inquisitive person, which every student must be. Whether, for example, jurisprudence, we talked about it, whether jurisprudence is the same thing as legal theory, is it the same thing as legal philosophy? Is it the same thing as empirical legal studies? Or are they different? Are they mere synonyms or merely coextensive things that are related to each other? That is the question that you have to take a look at and think about. And then and then you say, are there two types of understanding of law? The strict and the soft. The strict typified by the positivists, and the soft represented by socialists or the natural scholars, and even African jurisprudence. When we say African jurisprudence, every African that has talked about African jurisprudence talks about the issue of reconciliation, taking primacy over sanctions. So this is what we have as a background to your study of the schools of jurisprudence. And my hope is that when we start talking about the studies of jurisprudence, you will cast your mind back to some of these questions and be asking yourself whether what you are studying answers those questions, or do they even address those questions. Then when we come to class and we are talking and we ask questions among ourselves while we are discussing, we will have all this at the back of our minds. So, any questions, comments?
Sir, good morning, sir. Hopefully, my network is better now.
Okay.
I was going to ask if you can get the material that you're currently sharing on screen. I don't know if it's on the group, or I don't think I've seen this material.
I think we have a network issue with you again. The last thing I heard was you were interested in knowing if we could share some materials.
No, he's asking for you to send this material to us.
Don't you have this already?
This particular.
We have it now.
Hello?
This particular material.
Are you talking about this particular material or other materials?
We do.
Sir, we don't have it, sir.
I don't know.
Okay, don't worry. Before the lecture ends, I'm going to pass it on to your class rep.
This one, sir.
What's the second one? Does someone understand what he's trying to say so that the person can help us?
Thanks, sir.
Hello?
So I think he's requesting for the material you used in presentation, and you've already answered. You said you'd pass it to the class rep.
Okay. So that solves the problem. Now, if there are further materials that we need, we can have that discussion later, and I'll see what I can do for you. Any other question or comment?
Sir, I have a question. The material, like all the things you listed that we are going to do, nature of law, down to everything you listed at the beginning of the class, is that all we are doing for jurisprudence this semester?
For my class, yes, because it's very large. You could spend your whole year at the University of Ilorin doing only this. So what we're trying to do is just to shrink it to a level where we can all have a discussion about them, and then we go. But for my aspect of the class, these are the things that we are going to be discussing. Particularly, we've talked about the idea of law, which is really like an introduction to the schools of jurisprudence, but it's a topic on its own. We've dealt with that today. The next thing is the schools of jurisprudence, where we are going to be touching specifically on each school. Now, some of these will be dealt with by me, some by Dr. Mrs. Raji, and there are also some concepts that have already been dealt with by Professor Egbewole, and I think that should round up for this semester.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Any other comment? Can someone tell me about his impression of the class now? Do you feel after this class that there's trouble, or you are smiling, grinning from year to year and telling yourself, yes, I'm ready to deal with this thing?
I think we have two sides, do two of those sides in this class.
What are the two sides and what are they doing?
No, exactly what you said. Some people feel they are ready. Some people feel there's trouble.
There's no trouble, and I'll tell you why. I tell this to my children. There's something they call a mindset. And the first time I read about this thing called a mindset, it was actually a book that was introduced to me by someone, two books actually. And the first one was The Outlier. The second one was Mindset. And they looked at children in a school and they said, who are the children that go on to do great things? Who are the children that go on to do great things in the class and in the rest of the world? And they were able to identify two different types of children. One, a child that looks at a maths equation, for example, which was what I was when I was in school. The moment I saw numbers, my head would just scatter. And then another child sees the same numbers, and then he's doing this and so happy to be looking at these numbers, and he's asking himself, wow, this is wonderful. What can I do here? How do I address this? He's asking himself questions. He's thinking inquiry. And there's a reason why, according to the books, one person has a failure mentality while the other person has a challenge mentality. It's not that the guy that has the failure mentality knows it less. It is because the moment he looks at that equation, that thing, what he's thinking about is in terms of failure or success. And if what you are looking at is in terms of failure or success, it means you are already afraid. And as we all know, one of the greatest obstructions to understanding things is fear. But if you are not thinking about failure or success, and you are thinking in terms of acquiring knowledge, even acquiring failure knowledge is acquiring knowledge. And that is what opens your mind, because you are thinking in terms of, okay, there's knowledge to learn here. Let me see, okay, is this how you say it? Is this how you say it? And then there are more and more questions in your head. And in answering those questions, you get better at learning. But if you are thinking in terms of fail, pass, then I think it defeats the whole purpose of why you are here. Because you are here to learn. As I talk to you, I'm thinking of learning. So we should have this great competition of who learns more from the other. It's not about failing or passing. When you start getting scared is when you are thinking in terms of failing or passing. And that can be the greatest block to you understanding things that you want to understand. So if you have the mindset, an outlier is somebody who is operating on the edge of society. He's someone, these are the people that if you are talking about the top 5% in any society, they, in terms of knowledge, in terms of most things, they will probably be the top 5%. And their greatest characteristic is that they look at things as a challenge that they must triumph. They don't look at it as a problem that they must solve. It's not a problem, it's a challenge. And then you can solve it, you may not solve it. Perhaps sometimes not solving it leads you to even a greater solution. And that is why we talk about jurisprudence as being a course where there's no yes or no answer. It's just about how you approach the issues and how you analyze the issues. You can have someone who says yes to a jurisprudence question and he gets an A, and someone else says no to that same question and he still gets an A. I hope we understand that.
Yes, sir.
So there's no fear. Wherever it is, it's a journey. As I'm talking to you as your lecturer, there are a lot of things that confuse me about jurisprudence. But we just sit down and then we try to understand what it entails. So under no circumstances should you have this the theory or not. Then for the purposes of your exams, which I know some of you are just cracking your head and saying, now, can I, at the end of the semester, we can zero in on certain things that we need to know for that specific purpose. And I think it basically will narrow down a lot of the work for you. But if you think to yourself that there are things that we can just narrow down, so why do I have to know this? I think you're doing yourself a lot of injustice. Any other comments?
No, sir.
Okay, so we can call it
No,
a
sir.
day.
Thank you, sir.
And hopefully we start with the positivist school on Friday. Have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.
And you
Bye,
too,
sir.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.